When Mordecai learned all that had been done, Mordecai tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the midst of the city, and he cried out with a loud and bitter cry. He went up to the entrance of the king's gate, for no one was allowed to enter the king's gate clothed in sackcloth. And in every province, wherever the king's command and his decree reached, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting and weeping and lamenting, and many of them lay in sackcloth and ashes. When Esther's young women and her eunuchs came and told her, the queen was deeply distressed. She sent garments to clothe Mordecai, so that he might take off his sackcloth, but he would not accept them. Then Esther called for Hatach, one of the king's eunuchs, who had been appointed to attend to her, and ordered him to go to Mordecai to learn what this was and why it was. Hatach went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate, and Mordecai told him all that had happened to him, and the exact sum of money that Haman had promised to pay into the king's treasuries for the destruction of the Jews. Mordecai also gave him a copy of the written decree issued in Susa for their destruction, that he might show it to Esther and explain it to her, and command her to go to the king and beg his favor and plead with him on behalf of her people. And Hatach went and told Esther what Mordecai had said. Then Esther spoke to Hatach and commanded him to go to Mordecai and say, "All the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, there is but one law, to be put to death, except the one to whom the king holds out the golden scepter so that he may live. But as for me, I have not been called to come into the king these 30 days. And they told Mordecai what Esther had said. Then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, "Do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" Then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, "Go, gather all the Jews to be found in Susa, and hold a fast on my behalf, and do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my young woman will also fast as you do. Then I will go to the king, though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish." Mordecai then went away and did everything as Esther had ordered him.
Not sure as Americans we can understand what it would be like to know that there is a government entity that is calling for and planning to facilitate our destruction. I can tell you I've visited a concentration camp in Germany, and it feels like the ground is sacred, like the evil can still be felt. You look all around at the visitors, and they're red-faced and weepy, horrified at what took place on that ground. This is how I imagine the scene in Persia. There is this remnant of Israel who has narrowly escaped annihilation and exile, and they are not in a position to overthrow the Persian government, and they're not causing trouble. In fact, they are living with the consequences of their ancestors' sinful disobedience. And then they get word of this impending fate. They're devastated. And here's what they did in their devastation. They tore their clothes, wept, and humbled themselves to cry out to God. When is the last time you found yourself in devastation? Did it drive you to desperately call out to God? Esther got word that Mordecai is at the king's gate, and he's in sackcloth and ashes, and she's concerned. This is dangerous. He could get in a lot of trouble for that. So Esther sent him some clothes, but Mordecai refused. So Esther then enlisted the assistance of her eunuch, someone in her service whom she apparently trusted, Hathach. He's the eunuch who's going to serve as the go-between between Mordecai and Esther and allow them to communicate. And Mordecai, he's not going to mince any words. He sends the message to Esther that she needs to go before the king and beg and plead for mercy on behalf of her people. Now, keep in mind, the king does not even know that the Jews are her people. This could be catastrophic for Esther. To boot, Esther is going to send word back to Mordecai by saying, hey, just so you know, the king hasn't summoned me in over 30 days. And if I appear before him uninvited, well, if he doesn't extend his scepter, I could be killed. Now, let's pause for a moment. To this point in the account, what we know about Mordecai is that through no legal obligation, he has taken in Esther, cared for her, and raised her. He has continued to advise her and to check on her and to act on her behalf. By all accounts, Mordecai is a good guy. He's a God-fearing Jew. So when we hear how he responds to Esther, let's frame it through the lens of what we know his character to be. Mordecai sends word to Esther that God will save their people, but she will not be spared because of her status or her carefulness in following the rules of the king. He's reminding her that her hope is in God, not the king. And she receives this message knowing, like we've discussed, that she can trust Mordecai. And she asks him to spread the word to their people, to fast and pray for 3 days, at the end of which she will go before the king, knowing that she may perish. The study of Esther, this one that we're doing, it's called God's Call on a Queen. And we have witnessed to this point what it has looked like for God to call Esther as queen. And the events in Esther's life to this point have now made her willing to call on others. So in chapter 4, that's exactly what she does. She calls on others to pray, and then she will execute the call that is on her life as queen. We'll finish today by reading chapter 5. We'll find that Esther and her maidservants will fast and pray as well, alongside of her people. And on the 3rd day, she will not delay. She will go to the king, and she will invite him and Haman to a feast, to a banquet. For those of you keeping a list, I think we just saw God show up. She could have been killed. Instead, she will finish the day reclining at the table with the king, and he will offer her up to half his kingdom. Yeah, that sounds like God. Meanwhile, let's check in on Haman. Leaving the palace high on wine and self-inflation, he is going to encounter Mordecai, his arch enemy. And it sucks the life out of him. We get the sense that Haman cannot be happy as long as Mordecai is still walking the earth. And we'll see that once again, those close to Haman, his wife and his friends, are feeding this sinful pride rather than trying to calm him down or offer some prudent wisdom. In fact, the way they answer his distress is by encouraging him to build a gallows on which to impale or hang Mordecai. It seems to be the taste of blood that settles Haman. As we finish today's reading, I challenge us to reflect on the unlikely places that God has placed our feet, perhaps for such a time as this. Perhaps he's called you to something. But let's also reflect on the times where, like Haman, we have been motivated by pride, fear, sin, hatred, or perhaps just caught up in the wrong crowd. And finally, may we find example in the intentional time of prayer and fasting that we see Mordecai, Esther, and the Israelites exhibit. As we conclude by reading chapter 5 today, I pray it drives us to our knees, knowing that God's call on our life is worth it.
On the 3rd day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace, in front of the king's quarters, while the king was sitting on his royal throne inside the throne room opposite the entrance to the palace. And when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, she won favor in his sight, and he held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. Then Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. And the king said to her, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? It shall be given to you, even to half of my kingdom." And Esther said, "If it please the king, let the king and Haman come today to a feast that I have prepared for the king." Then the king said, "Bring Haman quickly, so that we may do as Esther has asked." So the king and Haman came to the feast that Esther had prepared. And as they were drinking wine after the feast, the king said to Esther, "What is your wish? It shall be granted to you. And what is your request? Even to the half of my kingdom it shall be fulfilled." Then Esther answered, "My wish and my request is, if I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it please the king to grant my wish and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come to the feast that I will prepare for them, and tomorrow I will do as the king has said." And Haman went out that day joyful and glad of heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, that he neither rose nor trembled before him, he was filled with wrath against Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home, and he sent and brought his friends and his wife Zeresh. And Haman recounted to them the splendor of his riches, the number of his sons, all the promotions with which the king had honored him, and how he had advanced him above the officials and the servants of the king. Then Haman said, "Even Queen Esther let no one but me come with the king to the feast she prepared, and tomorrow also I am invited by her together with the king. Yet all this is worth nothing to me, so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate." Then his wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, "Let a gallows 50 cubits high be made, and in the mornings tell the king to have Mordecai be hanged upon it. Then go joyfully with the king to the feast." This idea pleased Haman, and he had the gallows made.